Welcome back, commissioners, audience members, and the general public. We are very pleased to resume our agenda. We've got a lot still to go. And so we're delighted to come back from our lunch break and to hear from Vincent Mamano for the FHWA report. Thank you so much, Vince.
Good afternoon. I'll wait for everybody to sit down. Okay, good.
I'm
Thank
down,
you all.
Vince.
Appreciate it. If everybody would just keep it down, I'd appreciate it. I'm trying to talk. Hit your mute,
Down,
please.
Vince.
You're right. I am. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk today. First, since I'm pretty sure Paul von Konynenberg is not still on the call, I will compliment him, because if he was on it, I don't think I'd be able to. But no, Paul, if you're listening, I appreciated the partnership that we had and our ability to speak candidly. So thank you for your service that you did in your time as commissioner and continue to do, and just as the person you are and the family man that you are.
Thanks, Vince. I appreciate it.
Oh, darn it. He's still on. Shoot.
Gotcha.
Man. That's a cheap shot there. Also, I'd like to welcome Commissioner Egar and Davis. Welcome to the commission. I look forward to meeting you in person. So Federal Highways working, we're working remotely. I know there are some periodic in-person meetings, but our agency has taken the stance of we will be doing no in-person meetings for the safety of our employees. So that's evolving. That obviously will evolve, will continue to evolve. But if somebody needs Federal Highway to be at a location, please give me a call and I will discuss it with our leadership if there's an opportunity. David Kim, Secretary Kim, talked about the FAST Act reauthorization. So the FAST Act, that's our current authorization. We've talked about that several times. You have authorization and you have appropriations. And authorization is our contract authority. It gives our ability to advertise projects. It tells you your dollar amount that you're going to have throughout the year to obligate. And appropriations is the spending part of that. So the FAST Act, our authorization, and that's essentially all of our funding, expires on September 30th of this year. So thank you, David, for the summary of the proposed new legislation, new authorizing legislation, but that's a critical piece to transportation in California. I will be on a panel a little bit later discussing the effects of COVID and the Highway Trust Fund, so I won't get into that. A couple other things. We completed a freight assessment here in California, and that was more to inform Federal Highway on what we need to be doing for the states around the country. That information is going to go into our headquarters, and we're going to decide what kind of training we need to bring out to states and that type of stuff. The couple things I wanted to talk about or make sure I talked about is there's been a lot of discussion on equity, the discussion that Mr. Brown led. I wanted to share just a couple things. When I got here about 12 years ago, the disadvantaged business enterprise, DBE, participation on federally funded projects was somewhere in the range of 1% to 2%, maybe 3%. I don't think it ever got to 3%. We started putting goals on contracts, and there was a time when they were at 6.5%, I think, and then they moved up to 8 or 9, and there's no way we'd be able to get to 8 or 9. There's just no way, and then no way we'd be able to get to 12. Well, right now, California, and this is including state and local contracts, have a DBE participation rate on awarded contracts at over 18% at currently this year. So I don't think there's complete equity in that 18, but not, I don't think, I know there's not complete equity in that 18%. The overall goal is 17.6 here in the state. So I think Tokes, Commissioner Director Almashakin and I have had several discussions on this of how do we get to that equity in that. And I think the steps that District 10 and many of the other districts are doing that Tokes highlighted with the gentleman in District 10 and the efforts that they're trying to do to bring contractors on board, minority contractors on board is huge. Every opportunity we can, we are trying to do the outreach that needs to be done, information and education, and trying to connect DBEs, both prime and subcontractors, with primes, with other primes to help in that program. So again, that's 18% is fantastic, especially since where we came from, but it's not where we want it to be. So I just want to make sure everybody knows that nobody's happy with 18%. We're glad we're at 18%, but we're not done by any stretch of the imagination. It becomes second nature. The DBE program becomes less of a program to administer when we don't have to put goals on contracts, and we have participation from minority contractors without goals on contracts. So that's where the direction everybody's trying to get to. But directly to the equity discussion, I had an opportunity. I just thought I'd share with you, with the commissioners, that I had an opportunity to sit with Caltrans leadership in a discussion on equity. And I thought it was a very moving discussion. I think there was a lot of emotion in the discussion. A lot of people on the Caltrans leadership team who've gone through a lot of challenges and have made a concerted effort in trying to get to that equity. It was an excellent discussion. I think Director Almashakin is and Jim Davis. I think you need to know that the two of them are not, I've heard the word lip service used a lot, and they're clearly not using lip service. They're looking for an action plan. They're looking for direction. They want something to be done with this. I think they recognize they just got to start stepping in that direction. And I think Caltrans has been. I don't think you often get to see it because they're such a big agency, but there is a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of discussion going on, a lot of change that they've done, and I think it kind of hit to the makeup of Caltrans also, and that discussion was lengthy. Part of that discussion was hitting on the internal makeup of Caltrans and how do they make sure that they're developing everybody in their agency and giving everybody an opportunity. So I just wanted to share that. It was a very interesting conversation. It was one that didn't need to be led because everybody was in the meeting, and everybody in the meeting was in the discussion. So I look forward to being a part of how Federal Highway can help and see what we can do to be helping with our programs that allow California to be doing what you're trying to do. So I think that is all I have, and if there's any questions for me, I will be glad to take them.
Thank you very, very much. This is a very informative report. Commissioners, are there any questions of Mr. Mamano? Hearing none, thank you very much, and we'll move on to item number 13.
Good afternoon, Commissioner. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Philip Chu with San Bernardino County Transportation Authority, representing the RTPA group. This will be the last time for me to report to you as the RTPA moderator. The RTPA group has selected a new moderator for next year. Yvonne Garcia with Butte County Association Governments, who is also currently the vice moderator, will be taking over as the RTPA moderator. And Don Fatisse from San Diego Association of Governments will be stepping up as the vice moderator for the RTPA group next year. I'm confident both of them will carry on the great work we have accomplished between the RTPA group, CTC, and Caltrans. So thank you both for stepping up. On behalf of the RTPA group, I would like to wish Commissioner Van Knoudenberg all the best in your future endeavors. We enjoyed working with you in the past. Thank you. And also welcome Commissioner Davis and Eager. The RTPA group met yesterday via a Zoom conference call and discussed a number of topics. First, an update and overview from Caltrans on the governor's May revised budget, and the RTPA group would continue to monitor the funding impacts from the reduced transportation revenue due to COVID-19 pandemic. A presentation was provided by CalSTA on the Governor's Climate Change Executive Order in 1919. The RTPA group looked forward to working with CalSTA on providing input on the implementation schedule. The RTPA group also supports the CTC staff proposed short rail improvement program guidelines. We thank the CTC staff working with us on that and providing the flexibility in the program adoption schedule and application deadline. To close off my report, a bit of a personal note. In addition to this being my last RTPA moderator report, this would probably be my last CTC meeting. Taking on a new position at SBCTA as the tow operations administrator to manage our express lane projects. So I just want to say that I truly enjoyed working with everyone at Caltrans, CTC staff, and all their various RTPAs for the past 12 years. We as a team have definitely made some great progress in improving our transportation system in California. I'm definitely going to miss everyone and all the good discussion we have, both work and non-work related. Hopefully I'll get invited back one day to join one of the CTC receptions. That concludes my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you. And thank you for all of your work, and you'll definitely be invited back for any celebration you wish. Your work has been very much appreciated. Are there any questions, commissioners? Any comments? Okay. Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate this report, and good luck with your next venture. We're all behind you. Next is item 14, the Rural Counties Task Force. Is Mr. Delorias?
Good afternoon, commissioners. Vice Chair Norton. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you very much.
Well, welcome to the new commissioners, Eager and Davis. This is Woodrow Deloria with the Rural Counties Task Force and the El Dorado County Transportation Commission. And on behalf of the Rural Counties Task Force, I'd like to thank Paul Van Konynenberg for his leadership on the commission. His understanding and consideration of the rural transportation needs was clearly illustrated throughout his tenure on the commission. He was always a huge advocate for our rural counties and very accessible to all of our partners, and we wish him the best. The RCTF has not met since the last presentation I gave to your commission. Our next meeting will be on July 17th, and we'll continue to hold virtual meetings to discuss the issues and opportunities facing the 26 rural counties. Many of the rural counties are working with Caltrans regarding the implementation of SB 743, and we appreciate their willingness to consider the challenges and constraints that are specific to rural counties. We've also been tracking the Governor's Climate Change Executive Order at 1919, and while many rural counties have concerns, we look forward to working with the administration on the action plan to ensure that funding is protected for rural lifeline services and critical infrastructure needs in rural counties. Many of the rural county agencies continue to telecommute or work remotely during the pandemic. In fact, I've heard from a number of agencies who are changing their administrative practices and policies to encourage and allow for more telecommuting, even after we get through this pandemic. The one challenge that many of the rural agencies are facing is really access to high-speed internet or broadband. And I suspect that that's going to be elevated as a high priority for many of our rural counties going forward. On behalf of all 26 rural counties, I also wanted to acknowledge all the CTC staff who've always been very supportive to our rural members and recently have gone above and beyond to respond to questions and concerns while we're all working remotely. Their willingness to work with our staff directly has really been made clear throughout this incredibly disruptive time. So a big thank you from all of us to all the CTC staff and the commissioners. And with that, I conclude my report and be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Does any of the commissioners that you have any comments or questions? Wonderful. Thank you so much for your report today. With that, we'd like to go to Keith Dunn at the Self-Help Counties Coalition. Mr. Dunn? Okay. All right.
Keith, forgive me. Keith, I'm showing that you're self-muted.
Okay. We can come back to Keith We've got a ton of things on the agenda, so whenever he checks in, please let me know, okay? So with that, we will go to item 18, state and federal legislative matters. Paul?
Commissioners, tab 18, State and Federal Legislative Matters, is an action item to accept the staff report on legislation being monitored and to adopt a support position on one bill. As brief background, the deadline for the Senate to pass bills introduced in that House is this Friday, while the deadline for the Assembly to pass bills introduced in that House was last Friday. I am pleased to report that the Assembly passed AB 2285, authored by the Assembly Transportation Committee, which would implement a commission recommendation to dedicate the interest earnings in the road maintenance and rehabilitation account to the shop. This bill passed 78-0 and now heads to the Senate. At this time, Commission staff are recommending the Commission adopt a support position on Senate Bill 1291, which is authored by the Senate Transportation Committee. This bill would provide flexibility to transportation planning agencies in preparing their federal transportation improvement programs, as well as the Caltrans in preparing the federal statewide improvement program by removing the 2020 due date for these program submittals. This legislation is needed due to the uncertainties that resulted from the issuance of the SAFE Rule Part 2 that affected the preparation of these programs. That concludes my remarks on this item. I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions from the commissioners? And does anybody want to make a motion regarding the support of SB 1291?
This is Commissioner Liu. I will move to adopt the item and instruct staff to correct or update the list of commissioners on the letterhead for the letter.
Oh, good catch. Thank you very much. Is there a second to Commissioner Liu's motion? Is there a second to Commissioner Liu's motion?
Second.
Oh, thank you very much, Commissioner Burke. Douglas, will you please call the roll?
Commissioner Alvarado. Commissioner Burke.
Aye.
Commissioner Davis.
Aye.
Commissioner Dunn.
Aye.
Commissioner Eager.
Aye.
Commissioner Gardino.
Aye.
Commissioner Inman.
Aye.
Commissioner Kehoe.
Aye.
Commissioner Liu.
Aye.
Commissioner Tavaloni.
Aye.
Vice Chair Norton.
Aye.
Vice Chair, the motion is approved.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Item 19, the budget and allocation capacity. Paul?
Commissioners, tab 19 is an information item on budget and allocation capacity. Keith Duncan from Caltrans will first deliver a presentation reviewing the May revision state transportation revenue estimates, as well as the draft allocation capacity numbers for the upcoming fiscal year. And then after Keith's presentation, Chair Norton, I will make some remarks on how the May revision proposals affect the Commission's budget. So Keith.
Great. Hello, am I coming through clearly?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Madam Chair, Commissioners, as Paul mentioned, my name is Keith Duncan, and I'm with the Caltrans Division of Budgets, and today I'll be sharing the budget and capacity update with you. Given the time of the day, I will work to be as brief as possible on a few of these slides. Next slide, please. To start off, we wanted to provide you a status update regarding the Commission's allocation efforts for the current fiscal year. Through May, the Commission has allocated approximately $4.7 billion, or 66% of the available $7.1 billion allocation capacity. In viewing over the agenda later today, you will have a little over $2 billion of proposed allocations for your consideration. So a large chunk of that remaining capacity is expected to be committed, which is great news. And it is important to note that any unused or unallocated capacity after this meeting will roll over to next year, so we can continue to allocate to the respective transportation programs. Next slide, please. For this next slide, we wanted to provide you a transportation revenue update. This information was included in the governor's May revise that was released just a day after the last commission meeting in May. We wanted to show you the impacts, the 2-year impacts resulting from the COVID-19 impact, from the COVID-19 pandemic. As you can see in the slide, combined for the current year, for the rest of the current year, 1920, and the upcoming budget year, 2021, the total reduced revenue is about $1.9 billion. And this is across all revenue sources, as noted on the slide. Approximately $1.2 billion of that decrease is in fuel excise revenues. That reduction does impact both local and state highway transportation projects. Approximately $360 million of that decrease is from diesel sales tax revenue, and that directly impacts programs such as the State Transit Assistance, State Rail Assistance, as well as other programs funded by the Public Transportation Accounts. The May revise also includes a reduction of about $192 million in weight fee revenues, which reduces the amount available to relieve general fund of transportation-related debt. And lastly, across both the transportation and, improvement fee as well as the road improvement fee related to electric vehicles, we're seeing a combined reduction of almost $52 million, which also impacts local and state highway projects. With the reduction, with reduced consumption of fuel being a primary driver, we wanted to share a couple slides with you so you can see some of the trends that we're seeing both pre-COVID-19 pandemic usage or consumption as well as post over the last 2 months. Next slide, please. This first slide is intended to show 2-year gas consumption trends. As you can see, from moving from left to right, since July 18, you can see the general monthly trends, the ebbs and flows as we go through typical seasonal consumption trends, with the average monthly consumption rate being about 1.3 billion gallons. As you make your way further right, you'll see that come March 2020, that we happen to hit a peak in consumption through that period of time. And then the great pandemic reduction hit us beginning in April, as well as carrying over to May. April saw approximate reduction of about 22% in consumption compared to the prior year, and May saw a reduction of about 34%. Based on preliminary information, we anticipate June to follow this similar reduced consumption trends, and it'll also continue into the next fiscal year. While this is just a 2-year monthly consumption, we wanted to take some time just to kind of broaden that period of time and kind of go back 20 plus years to see how the pandemic is impacting overall as compared to times such as the Great Recession. Next slide, please. This next slide is, or at least the next 2 slides, we wanted to show consumption trends dating back to 1997. This slide has a lot of information, so just to kind of go over some of it. There on the top of the graph, you can see a green dotted line that represents annual vehicle miles traveled, or VMT. Right below it, you see an orange dotted line that represents annual consumption levels. And then the bars right below that, those are intended to show the percentage difference on an annual basis when it comes to annual consumption. So basically, the blue bars represent an increase, a percentage increase from the prior year's consumption, and the yellow bars represent a decrease as compared to the prior year. Beginning back in 1997, you can see both VMT and consumption followed similar trends as it increased as the economy was growing. And then right around the time of the Great Recession, we started to see the economy falling, and we started to see a separation in both vehicle miles traveled and consumption. We know that this similar information has been shared with the Commission in the past, but at about this time, we started to see increased fuel efficiency in our gas vehicles driven around the state, as well as increased usage of alternative fuel vehicles. And while electric fuel or electric vehicles technology was still at its infancy, we know that as we continue to move right on this chart here, we know that electric vehicles also started to play a role in that separation. As you continue to go from left to right, you can see as the economy started to recover after the Great Recession, both VMT and consumption continued to increase, just at differing rates. And then we reach just this last fiscal year of 18-19, where VMT hit its all-time high as consumption started to decrease. It is important to note on this slide, this data for both 1920 and 2021 is based on the governor's budget that was released in January. So even in the January proposed budget, there was a projected decrease in consumption, albeit slight, but we wanted to share that information. Now, the next question you may want to ask is, well, how does this compare to the COVID-19 projected reduction in consumption? Next slide, please. Now you can see the drastic decrease when it came to both the 1920 and the 2021. When it comes to this slide, everything from 1997 from the far left all the way to 1819 to the right is the same information contained on both slides. The difference being on this slide here for 1920 and for 2021 is based on the COVID-19 revised projections. As you can see, the reduction that is projected for the current fiscal year of 2019-2020 far out exceeds any year that reduction that we experienced during the Great Recession. So we're definitely experiencing unprecedented times. Okay, so commissioners, well, let's go next slide, please. I'm sorry about that. Okay, commissioners, for this next slide, as is customary at the CTC meeting prior to the end of the fiscal year, we're presenting our draft allocation capacities for the upcoming fiscal year. To echo Commissioner Inman's earlier comments about how transportation projects support growth for our struggling economy, these numbers that are being presented to you today as our draft allocation capacity are based on our fund estimate that was adopted, the 2020 fund estimate that was adopted by the Commission back in August. These are based on pre-COVID-19 revenues, and we feel it is important that transportation play a leading role in the recovery of the economy. So we do, these proposed numbers are drawing on our reserves to make this investment level continue to happen. We do, as mentioned by our Chief Financial Officer, Stephen Keck, at the May Commission meeting, we do have several positive factors that we feel will be playing a role in mitigating the reduced revenue levels that we anticipate to see over the next fiscal year. We have healthy cash balances in our major transportation accounts. We do expect to see contract savings, bid savings, as we experienced during the Great Recession. In fact, I believe it was about 2 weeks ago, there were a handful of bids that were open that already exceeded 30%, which means that's savings that can both make up the lost revenue as well as can be reinvested for additional projects. In addition to that, at the federal level, as been echoed by Secretary Kim, Director Omashakin, as well as Mr. Mamano, we know that both the stimulus, there's been ongoing discussions about a potential stimulus package and the reauthorization of the Transportation Act coming in September and October, which will also work to offset those lost revenues. So in looking at the numbers, as mentioned before, these are based similar to what was included in the 2020 fund estimate. Both the SHOP and the STIP programs, in compared to last year's draft capacity numbers, the SHOP, we're proposing an increase of about $300 million, and the STIP, an increase of about $30 million, as well as the aeronautics, the active transportation program, the solution for congested corridors program, local partnership program. All of those programs are being, the draft numbers that you see in front of you are identical to what was presented last June for those respective programs. As next steps, we would be working with CTC staff as we work to finalize these allocation capacities. And in August, we'll present to you the final allocation capacity numbers, which these numbers will be, in addition, we will add any carryover capacities for any unallocated funds after this meeting. Next slide, please. Okay, for a quick summary, for upcoming events coming here in July, there is the scheduled increase related to the per SB1. On July 1st, both gasoline and diesel excise taxes will be increased. Gas will be increasing about 3.2 cents per gallon, and diesel will be increasing about 2.2 cents per gallon. Also, beginning in July, the road improvement fee, which is paid at time of registration, it is a $100 fee on zero-emission vehicles that for model year 2020 and newer. And then obviously the ongoing discussion about the potential stimulus package for transportation. In August, we do anticipate the final allocation capacity to be presented to the Commission, as well as the upcoming, as normal, the federal August redistribution, in which there's always hopes that we would receive more than we anticipate. And then in September, the Federal Transportation Act, FAST Act, is set to expire. So with ongoing discussion about the reauthorization, we're looking forward to that. And with that, next slide. With that, I'd like to thank Commission staff for their help during this presentation. And prior to turning it back over to Paul, I'm available for any questions you may have.
Well, thank you. This is very, very informative, and your graphs are sobering. I wanted to open it up for Commissioner Inman to ask some questions.
I just have one request. Thank you very much. I appreciate this information. On the very first slide, that is the state revenue impacts, would it be possible to get a percentage for each one of those, so we can have at the tip of our tongue what percentage the gasoline excise is off and the diesel excise? I think that would be important for all of us to frame.
Yes, Commissioner, we can work with CTC staff to get that to you.
Great.
Thanks.
Okay. Are there any other questions from any other commissioners? Okay, we're very much looking forward to the future presentations and understanding where we've gone from what you anticipate. Thank you so much. This was very clear and very well presented. With that, I'd like to go back to
Commissioner Norton, this is Paul. There is a second part of this item where I'm going to discuss the how some of the May revision proposals affect the Commission's budget directly.
Right. I was going to go back to you to handle the rest of that. Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks for jumping in. Thanks.
I thought you were going moving on.
No problem.
So first, the May revision includes a 10% reduction to state worker compensation that will begin in the upcoming fiscal year starting July 1st. And collective bargaining is underway to implement this, and some units have already announced agreements. And second, the May revision has a 5% reduction to virtually all state department budgets, including the Commission's budget. This reduction will not start this July. It will start July 2021, so 1 year from now. And there's a few aspects of the Commission's budget I would like to discuss in the context of these reductions. First, Commission staff have projected out expenses in the context of the 5% reduction and have identified a potential issue in the 2021-22 fiscal year if a higher than average number of Commission staff retire and receive payments for their leave balances. Second, the Commission has 8 limited term positions that it received in the current fiscal year, which need to be made permanent in the 21-22 budget. These positions were provided for the Commission to address the increased workload from Senate Bill 1. And related to this, Commission staff also are planning to request the Department of Finance authorize the conversion of an existing position into a second deputy for programming to ensure effective oversight of SB1 programs. Lastly, I wanted to note the 10% compensation reduction does not affect the Commissioner per diem of $100. While this per diem is not affected, I would note that it has not been adjusted since 1978 and has lost 75% of its purchasing power since that time. And that in recent months, some stakeholder organizations had raised concerns about the level of the per diem and the ability for all qualified individuals to serve on the commission without financial burden. That concludes my remarks. I'm happy to take questions.
Yes, I wanted to ask you and Director Weiss about the equity analysis RFP and budget cuts.
Yes, I can go ahead and answer that. So this was a RFP that the commission had put out earlier this year. We were able to do it with some savings that we had, primarily because it took us a little while to fill the positions that we got this year in this year's budget. So we were anticipating having funding available. Unfortunately, with the state's very significant budget crisis this year and next, the governor's direction was that contracts be canceled except for a very limited type or groups of exceptions.
Thank you. That was brought up in item 17, and I wanted to make sure people understood why it was not moving forward, and it was just due to our budget constraints. I also wanted to ask about the per diems, and is that being addressed statewide among commissions as a proposal about kind of having a cost of living increase, since it's been 40 years since the $100 per diem was instituted?
So per diems for serving on a commission vary by commission. There's not a uniform rate. My understanding is that recently they have adjusted the Public Utilities Commission per diem, or at least proposed to. I'm not sure if it's been enacted yet, as well as certain other commissions. They've looked at it as well.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from our commissioners? Okay, seeing none. Paul, thank you very much. That concludes item 19, correct?
Correct.
Okay, great. I would like to go back to Keith Dunn for item 15, as I believe he's back on the line to speak about the Self-Help Counties Coalition.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I apologize for my inability to operate a computer. I am available for any physical labor, which I excel at. So if anyone needs lessons on how not to interact on one of these, come talk to me. I would like to say on behalf of the Self-Help Counties, a thank you to Paul Van Kneinenberg for his service. He made great efforts to reach out to each and every one of the self-help counties and try and get a grasp on the varying issues that they all grapple with, and collectively we grapple with in providing infrastructure and partnering with the state. So we'd like to thank him for his service, and then also congratulate new commissioners Eager and Davis on their appointments. We look forward to working with them. And then lastly, Vice Chair Norton, on your Senate confirmation, we're pleased to support you and get you through that process. I am pleased to report the Self-Help Counties had a board meeting recently and made a number of policy decisions moving forward through the year, which we'll discuss later in the report on the COVID impacts. Part of that presentation, we did also have the opportunity to meet with CalSTA on the climate change executive order and get a presentation on the timing, and we're allowed to offer some comments and participate in that process, and we look forward to providing input as we move forward with that order. I am pleased to report, and some of you have heard me talk about this for the last few years, that Congress will be introducing an amendment to H.R. 2 that would address the FAA's changed interpretation of a former rule and how they treat aviation fuel excise tax. This is an issue that the self-help counties and the state of California have been engaged in for a few years. In my interpretation of this, are diverting what used to be sales tax from local measures and putting it towards airports that was not intended originally by the rule in Congress. So HR 2, which is the amendment, which is being sponsored by Congresswoman Napolitano and a number of our other congressional delegation, would address this rule. We have no feedback yet on what the Trump administration his opinion is on this. They have fought it traditionally, and I imagine it will be a bit of a fight, but we're very optimistic and we're very pleased that there's an effort to go back to the original intent of Congress that exempted special sales tax from that rule of investing in airports. It was just for the general sales tax on aviation fuel. So that's a good move from Congress, and we're very pleased that our delegation has continued to work on this issue. Self-help counties has additionally been continuing to meet with Caltrans. They have established a 743 working group. We've participated in a number of webinars where I was actually able to dial in and speak, amazing everyone in attendance. But the group has provided additional comments, and like many, we're concerned on many levels on the new VMT program, but trying to work to find an opportunity to meet the climate goals of the state while still delivering on the promises of our local expenditure plans. One of the issues that we were able to come to resolution at our board meeting was that the Focus on the Future conference for 2020 will be a virtual conference. Like most organizations that have large events, the Self-Help Counties Board of Directors decided that given the COVID crisis, it just did not make sense to try and host an in-person meeting. So we will be doing a virtual conference the same days in November, and looking to work with many of you to help put together some program materials that will be impactful and still make the event worth people's time. Other than that, we'd like to thank the Commission for the continued partnership, and we look forward to working with you as we all work to build out of the current COVID impact on our revenue streams. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you. And thank you very much for your support yesterday and for your support of Inspector General Rhonda Clark. That was very helpful, and we appreciate your testimony. I think your report is going to lead well into the next item, which is item 20 on the impacts of COVID-19 and federal and local transportation revenues. But before we do that, are there any questions for Mr. Dunn from the rest of the commission? Okay, well, with that, we'd like to have Paul. Oh, we have one public comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. We have one written comment. This comes from Rosa De Leon Park, Executive Director with Stanislaus Council of Governments. I would like to congratulate Commissioners Eager and Davis on their appointments. And Stanislaus, we look forward in meeting with you in person when it is safe to meet again. I would also like to acknowledge Commissioner Paul Van Konijnenburg for his leadership, tireless engagement, and willingness to listen and learn from the communities throughout California on every transportation matter. Thank you, Commissioner Paul Van Konijnenburg, for your time served as our commissioner. That concludes my remark. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Lovely remarks. Okay, with that, we will conclude item 15 and begin item 20. Paul, would you lead this one off?
Commissioners, tab 20 is an information item on the impacts of COVID-19 on federal and local transportation revenues. We will hear about these impacts from 4 presenters, and we will start with Vincent Mamano from the Federal Highway Administration.
So hello again. So I'll try and run through my talking points very quickly. One of the places, obviously, that the COVID situation has caused a dramatic shift is in the Highway Trust Fund. The 2021 President's budget, the Highway Trust Fund was estimated to experience a cash shortfall during late 2021 to early 2022, fiscal year 2022. The recent significant reduction in travel, current projections indicates that the Highway Trust Fund will experience a shortfall in 2021. Just a quick recap for everybody who isn't quite as involved in the Highway Trust Fund as I am and others. The Highway Trust Fund is comes from the federal excise taxes, and the taxes are levied on gasoline, diesel, truck and trailer sales, heavy vehicle use, and truck tire sales. The the gas tax is 18.4 cents per gallon, and the diesel tax is 24.4 cents per gallon. And that gas tax goes into the Highway Trust Fund has two accounts that it takes care of. It's the highway account and the mass transit account. In the highway account, that includes the Federal Highway Administration programs, Federal Motor Carrier Safety, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and the Office of the Secretary of Transportation. The mass transit account includes the programs for Federal Transit Administration. And in fiscal year 2019, the revenues for the highway account were $34.4 billion, and for the mass transit account were $5.5 billion. So the big thing we're looking at here is the shortfall, is the potential of a shortfall. So a shortfall is essentially there is more bills getting paid than money coming in. So as we're collecting the gas tax, the states are asking for more reimbursements than we are collecting in gas tax. And of course, the COVID-19 has exacerbated the situation, significantly reducing the receipts. Now, will the Highway Trust Fund go broke, or will it ever get to zero? The answer to that question is no. In the past, or at different times, the general fund has had transfers that would build up the Highway Trust Fund, or we would slow our outlay. So if we get to the point where we just don't have the money coming in and there is no transfer from the general fund, then Federal Highway just won't pay all of the requests that are being made by the state. So once we may be if a request from the state comes to us, we may be, depending on how much money is in the trust fund, may be paying either 100% of that request or 80% or 50 or whatever that number needs to be to make sure the Highway Trust Fund doesn't go bankrupt. So the spending for the Highway Trust Fund has outpaced revenues for over a decade. In fiscal year 2019, the Highway Trust Fund had $56.1 billion in expenditures while taking in $44.5 billion in revenue. So that resulting in a $11.6 billion deficit. And you're kind of wondering, hey, why is this outpacing the revenue? Why is the spending outpacing the revenue? And part of that is the programs supported by the Highway Trust Fund have increased in size in the recent decades. And, you've seen that over the most recent legislations that we've had, authorizing legislations. The tax that supports the Highway Trust Fund was last adjusted by Congress in 1993. And then obviously the increase in fuel efficiency has eroded the revenue from the gas and diesel taxes. So there, and like I mentioned before, some of the ways some of these shortfalls have been dealt with. In 2018, Congress transferred $144 billion in additional funds into the Highway Trust Fund from the general fund, or primarily from the general fund. And then when the FAST Act came around in 2016, that included a $70 billion transfer. But to look right now at the impacts of COVID directly, if you look back at the revenues in the past compared to 2019, so we're going to look at 2019 and 2020. From April 1 to April 15, there was $1.6 billion coming in, or $1 million coming in, $1 billion coming into the Highway Trust Fund. And in 2020, it's $1.2 billion. So that's a difference of 26% less money coming into the highway account. From April 16th to April 30th, it's 46% less. And from May 1st to May 15th, it's 42% less. So we're looking at right now, because of the now we're seeing traffic starting to pick up a little bit, so we're going to see those revenues increasing at some point in time. But there's a delay on the receipts, so we'll find out more what happened in later May, the last 2 weeks of May, soon, to see if that started to build back up again. So I'll conclude quickly that Federal Highway is looking at making sure the scenarios don't, bring us to a shortfall. But the different scenarios that we've run assume a gradual return to normal revenues by October of 2020, a gradual return to revenues by January of 2021, and then another scenario is April of 2021. And all three of those scenarios will shows that the highway account will reach a critical point in spring of 2021 and a shortfall by summer of 2021. So our new legislation that should be coming, that we're hoping to have in September, if it doesn't address the shortfall, then we're going to have an issue with the highway account come spring of 2021. So that's all I have right now to present.
Okay. Paul, are there other speakers to present on this?
Yes, next we'll hear from Keith Dunn from the Self-Help Counties.
Thank you very much, Paul. I don't know if we're going to be putting up, there we go, okay. So Self-Help Counties Coalition, as you all know, is driven by funding from sales tax measures that local agencies pass in their own jurisdictions. What we're looking at in the first slide here is the actual numbers from the last year's 18-19 fiscal years. And I'm not going to go through each of these numbers, but we can make this available. And I will also say that we have 15 agencies that are listed here out of the 25. Obviously, as you all are aware, having the impact to staffing and working remotely and then trying to keep the programs running, we were able to get 15 of the 25 in the time frame that we were allocated with the CTC. So this list, we will have a complete list at some point. This is the list based on the timeline and ability for agencies to respond.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
So we can take them. So if you can just look at these numbers, they speak for themselves. This was last year. We can go to the next slide. So this is the current year projected prior to COVID, and then we have the projection post-COVID. And I'm just going to take a couple of the counties and just look at those numbers. What I can tell you is that consistently we're seeing the reductions from anywhere to 10 to upward of 20 to 25% in the post-COVID reductions. Contra Costa County, which is on the first line, had it projected at 94 million, and then post-COVID's down to 80.5 million. Santa Barbara from 38 to 37, so a little less of an impact. San Diego from almost 320 down to 297. So there's a fairly consistent decrease from anywhere to 10 to 25%. And again, we'll make these numbers available and hopefully have a complete list in short order for the commission and others. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So these are just more numbers, actuals. As many of you know, there's a lagging indicator on sales tax. One component that will likely change some of these numbers as we get further out from the initial COVID impact is that the governor, I think, wisely allowed for a deferral of sales tax to small businesses. I think that was a step that likely did a lot to save a lot of small businesses, but it also created some uncertainty in the numbers from actuals that were coming in on sales tax, because those taxes that originally would have been paid in the first quarter got deferred out until the second. So when we start looking at the actual numbers for April and May of 2020, I anticipate that they will likely go up a bit. We did see an uptick in April after initial declines in March. So again, these numbers are likely to change as businesses that had deferred initial sales tax payments start putting that money back in the system. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So these are final projections, and again, these are based on the numbers that we have in real time, again, lagging indicators on payments, and again, we saw a slight uptick in April, but you can see that consistently across the board, there's general reductions of 10 to 15%. So how does this impact our programs? You know, a lot of our funding programs are in progress already, so I'm hopeful that we're not going to see a lot of delays on projects that are currently underway. I doubt that we will, but obviously this is going to have a longer term impact if we can't find additional revenues, either through jumpstarting our economy itself or partnering with the federal government and identifying additional resources. The self-help counties, as you know, is a driving economic engine through the construction industry. Traditionally, in a normal year, we invest a little over $4.5 billion now into the state of California. So it's a very large economic factor for the state of California, and we're looking forward to returning to the normal status of things. I believe that's my last slide. Do we have one more slide, or is that it? Yep, that's it. So again, we will be updating the numbers as we get true ups from the state. We'll be adding the remainder of the 10 counties in, but you can see very clearly that the reductions in revenue is substantial, and we're anticipating that those numbers may improve a little bit, but it's still going to be an impactful reduction in revenue. 15 to 20%. So I'm happy to answer any questions that people may have.
Yes.
And
before we let you go,
report.
Keith, Commissioner Dunn does have a question for you. So Commissioner Dunn?
Okay.
Hey, Keith. Thanks very much for doing this. Just as I'm listening to all of these financial presentations, can you remind us of the percentages, the overview of what in all of the macro of transportation funding, what percentage is locally derived versus state and federal derived? Can you give me that macro?
Well, I can tell you that on capital projects, principally the locals are the driving financial factor in upwards of 80%. You know, the state of California is the principal funder on SHOP, which you know, you're very aware of as a funding partner. But from the STIP perspective, principally the local agencies are the primary funders in partnership again with the state and the federal government. But typically, it is upward of I don't know, in general, 70 or more % on the capital program side, and sometimes even more than that, and sometimes in the 90s. So it depends on the project specifically and how it lines up with partnerships with the state and the federal government.
Right.
But
yeah, I promise I wouldn't hold you to it, but just in general, about 70 to 80%. And this is for new projects versus repairs and maintenance on the shop side, which is driven primarily at the state level.
That is correct.
Got it.
And
Thanks.
you know, you bet. Always happy to answer.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Questions from my dear cousin.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Any other questions for Keith Dunn before we go to Rick Tippett? Okay, Rick, take it away.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair and Commissioners. I'm Rick Tippett. I'm the Trinity County Director of Transportation and this year's President of the County Engineers Association, California. CEAC is an affiliation of the California State Association of Counties who advocate on our behalf. Next slide, please. As mentioned by other speakers, the Department of Finance has projected significant fuel tax revenue reductions in the current budget year and for next year. Compared to the 2020 estimates we had earlier this year, the fuel tax revenue to cities and counties is projected to decrease by a combined $487 million in this fiscal year and then next. So next slide, please. Counties and cities receiving formula reductions, or formula allocations, both pre-SB1 fuel tax revenues from the Highway Users Tax Account, or HUDA, and in addition to fuel tax and vehicle fees revenues from SB1, maintenance rehabilitation account. Due to the reduced fuel consumption, the annual HUDA revenues are expected to decrease between 7 and 8%, and for this year and next. And as compared to the January 2020 estimates, the annual RMRA revenues are expected to go down 9 to 10%. Next slide. Well, fuel consumption went down quickly when shelter-in-place started. The collection distribution of the process of fuel tax revenues meant that the counties didn't see a significant reduction in revenues until about May. We saw a little bit in April, but it really started to show up in May, and it's continuing in June as we expected. Accordingly, many agencies are still reviewing planned revenues and expenditures to determine the impacts of projects. That's probably one of the biggest things, is that it's been really hard to predict exactly what's going to happen and how long it's going to happen. So trying to get an idea of what is going on out there, we surveyed the counties and found that most don't expect to reduce revenues to affect projects in this current year, which ends in a week. But some counties are already considering narrowing scopes of projects or delaying projects planned for the next fiscal year until future fiscal years. So a lot of us are viewing these decreases as a one-time issue that has to be smoothed out over the next couple of years. And as I said earlier, right now there's a lot of variables going on that we're uncertain about. Some counties have already submitted to the CTC their RMRA list, are exploring other options to move forward with the projects that are included in this list. However, there's others that are concerned about projects that they included in the previous submitted list that may not be feasible to complete this summer due to lack of funding. Counties may experience issues from providing matching funds for projects that they committed to prior to COVID. In some cases, counties may need to delay grant funded projects that rely on local match from gas tax. So the problem is, if we don't have that local match, we have to either delay something or look at another way to match that project. Orange County commented that they were doing a lot of co-op projects with cities, and that right now they're looking at having to delay some of those. So it does, a co-op project with the city could be affected, which alters both of our budgets. In response to the reduction of the HUDA revenues, the counties are planning to make various types of adjustments. Counties may have to cut contracts, furlough staff, or freeze vacant positions, such as Calaveras I had mentioned that they would be doing, which puts pressure on staff and reduces the amount of work counties can complete. Then there's a lot of the counties have other revenue streams that are focused on non-gas tax funded projects, such as flood control or developer impact fee funded projects. And with the delay of projects here, they'll send staff over to those projects where the revenue impacts are not so long lasting. But again, as I said, that ends up reducing the amount of staff that we have to get work done, so it's going to make things a little bit busier. And then finally, this is one that's near and dear to my heart, is we've been pushing equipment and material purchases back to help balance the budget. We had planned on buying some equipment for CARB, and instead of being able to look at it right now, we're thinking about looking at it next budget year. If impacts to revenues are pushed out or prolonged, we're going to have to really push out a lot of projects. Counties are expected to have to cancel contracts, and there are fewer larger rehabilitation projects that we'll be able to complete. Counties will likely have to hire less temporary help, like that's the current plan in Nevada, which, as I mentioned earlier, will increase the workload again to current county staff. As noted by Keith Dunn, the counties with self-help measures are also expecting to see a significant revenue reduction. Many of these measures include return to source funds to individual counties and cities. Next slide, please. So that brings us to some possible solutions that are coming in. The counties right now are actively supporting additional federal aid for COVID relief and transportation, as well as stimulus funds for transportation infrastructure. Our priorities include matching existing formulaic allocations to cities and counties to backfill what we've lost, and which will in turn prevent project plan for this year and next year from being delayed. So it gets to what would be our projects if we had more stimulus. And we continue to maintain the Fix It First strategy, which is the core of the RMRA program. And so we want to definitely make sure that we continue that forward. But if we had stimulus, we would also look to prioritizing local bridge funding. Right now, $110 million of bridges are ready to be constructed now. And this includes 19 bridges throughout the state. And then within 6 months, we're expecting to have another 27 projects worth $264 million that'll be ready to advertise. Without any stimulus, we'll be looking at spreading those bridges over the next 2 years or more. And then finally, our high priority is safety projects. Last grant cycle, California Local Aid SIP program was approximately $170 million in quick delivery safety projects, which were intended to be out within 2 to 3 years. Local agencies have shown that they could put out an additional cycle similar safety projects using up to another $200 million of safety improvements, and I would say probably even more than that if everybody knew we had the money. There's a lot of safety projects that are out there. Slide 5, or next slide, please. So with that, I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
I have a question for you before I open it up to the rest of the commissioners, and that is, how can we be positioning our projects to, knowing that there are a number of federal legislative solutions coming out and that are funded with funds that could be leveraged for projects that meet the right criteria? What are we doing to analyze our portfolios so that we can look at where we can leverage our funds with federal dollars so that we can have funds potentially available for other needs in the state?
Well, as I understand the question is if we have federal funds that are coming in, what can we do to leverage those federal funds to be able to turn around and use state funds on other projects to make those projects move forward faster?
Yes, and position our projects to make sure we're in the best stead to be able to take advantage of programs that are being outlined in like HR 2 and other federal legislation.
Well, I know here in Trinity, being that we're 76% federally owned, we have a lot of projects that end up being requiring both a NEPA and the CEQA documents. So that, in a sense, federalizes the projects, and they have come back and taken our state-only monies for those projects, and since they're federalized, turn it over to being toll credits or things like that, where it's federal dollars being spent instead of state dollars, so that we could use the state dollars on other things. But what are we doing in positioning? I believe Chris Lee is on the phone from CSAC, and he might be able to answer that question a little better than I could. Well, unfortunately, no Chris yet. Did I answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you. That's very, very helpful. Are there other questions from our commissioners? Okay, with that, is Michael Coleman available?
I am. Good afternoon,
Wonderful.
and commissioners. My name is Michael Coleman. I'm an advisor to California local governments specializing in municipal finance, and I operate the site californiacityfinance.com, the California Local Government Finance Almanac. Among my clients are the League of California Cities and the California Society of Municipal Finance Officers. Next slide. The types and magnitudes of city revenues that are affected by this downturn are primarily in the area of sales tax and hotel taxes. You've already heard some today. And so the biggest impacts we're really seeing are in our general funds. And specifically, cities that are getting impacted are those with high dependencies on sales taxes, on tourist-based economies, on transient hotel taxes as well, hotel taxes. Although I should say that it really varies from community to community because sales taxes are very much dependent upon the particular type of local economy. They're situs-based taxes for the most part. Communities that have sales taxes that are very tourist-based are dramatically affected, or restaurant and entertainment, of course. However, those that have Costco's or Walmart's or are the beneficiaries of online situs sales from warehouse sales, they're doing fairly well by comparison. So the impact really varies from community to community depending upon their dependence and the nature of their local economy, but it's quite dramatic. Our estimate is it's about $7 billion through the next couple of years in general revenue shortfall for our local agencies. And all cities are affected regardless of size. The ones that are having the most difficulty of this, of course, the ones that are most dependent upon tourist-based economies, but also those that have been running a thin margin with regard to budget reserves and have just been not prepared for this downturn. The next slide. So our surveys indicate that because of this downturn, cities are going to be looking at reductions in services across the board, and that includes in the areas of public works and streets. It's going to be very difficult for a lot of cities to meet their maintenance of effort requirements under SB1. Many are struggling to do that. And so we are really making a strong pitch to the federal government to please step up with something like the HEROES Act and provide some general purpose revenue to local governments, state and local governments, to help us deal with this. The CARES Act that was passed provided substantial revenue for the top 6 cities, most populous cities in California, of about $1.5 billion. It provided through the state, and the proposal that's being looked at right now, included in the state budget that they'll be voting on this week. It includes money for the next 7 cities in large amounts, and then another, that's $225 million, and another $275 million spread across the other 460 cities. This CARES Act money that's now being allocated, though, is only for COVID-related expenses and does not help us with the general revenue losses. So it's not of any use to help us meet our maintenance of effort requirements, for example. So next slide. One of the things that we're seeing happening, as you've already heard, is because of the drop in consumption because of the stay-at-home orders and the COVID response, we've seen a dramatic decline in fuel consumption, certainly by comparison to what we had planned on in January. But an interesting thing when you look at the HUDA and RMRA revenues combined and how those are coming in, and the red line here in this chart shows where we are in the current fiscal year, is that when you take into account all these elements of the local streets and roads accounts, this year, even with that downturn in consumption and the revised revenue estimates, we're expecting, and this is based on Department of Finance's most recent estimates that they're using in the state budget. We adopt those. Cities, CSAC, and I work together on these numbers. We're looking at a modest increase year over year in the current year ending this month. And that's primarily, almost entirely, because of the reset of the fuel tax swap rate, the Section 2103 fuel tax swap rate reset that was done last July 1st of 2019 under SB1. The reset of that rate, you can see the top orange bar there, the topmost orange bar, that's because of the reset of that rate. And that helps to really buffet this year, even though there's a decline in consumption and actually a year over year decline of some 9%, as it was Rick explained earlier, a year over year in the RMRA, for example. Next year, similarly, because we're looking to an increase in the tax rate that was already described on July 1st of this year across the board of the rates, including the vehicle registration tax, including the local excise taxes. This will keep us, even taking into account the decline in consumption from what we anticipated in January. Because of those rate increases, we would expect to see about a 3% increase year over year next fiscal year, beginning this July, based on current estimates over the prior year, even taking into account declines in consumption. So the biggest impact, perhaps, is really in the areas that are much more dependent upon price-based. And so that is really where the issues come into with cities and with counties in the area of these self-help counties, which are much more dependent upon price-based or taxable sales-related funding sources, such as the sales tax. And we're seeing a dramatic downturn in the sales taxes in this quarter alone, second quarter of 2020, about a 35% decline in sales tax revenues. But taken overall for the total fiscal year compared to the prior fiscal year, it's about a 7% downturn. That matches up with what the State Department of Finance is looking at in their budget estimates as well. The next year, it's much more uncertain at this point, depending on a lot of things. It could be a downturn compared to the prior year of an additional 2% to 13%, a further decline from the current year, depending upon how severe and how quickly we can recover from this. So that's a further depression, of course, on these vital sales tax revenues that are critical, of course, for our self-help counties. So bottom line, of course, is that the federal support and the federal action on this is really critical in the coming weeks, we hope. With that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. Very much appreciated your presentation, Mr. Coleman. And with that, are there any questions from our commissioners? Thank you. We are really looking forward to continuing to monitor this item and to look at how our funds are going to be impacted by COVID-19. So I thank you, Paul, for putting together this expert panel to give us their best advice. With that, Paul, we go on to item 21 on telework and transportation with Ellen Greenberg.
Commissioners, tab 21 is an information item on telework and transportation. At the May Commission meeting, a few commissioners had asked Caltrans Director Omashakin about the impacts of telework on the transportation system and what the state is doing in this area. So today, Caltrans Deputy Director of Sustainability, Ellen Greenberg, will present on this topic.
Thank you, Paul. Maybe you can confirm that I'm successfully connected on the audio.
Confirmed. Thank you very much, Ellen.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, commissioners. I recognize that the agenda has gotten pretty challenging, so happy to say this is a brief presentation anticipating further interaction and following on the exchange that the commissioners had with the director, as Paul noted. Next slide, please. I'm sure many of us have heard the governor using the phrase meeting the moment during the course of the COVID emergency. So we're starting with that concept and recalling that it was on March 19th that the governor issued the statewide stay-at-home order in response to the COVID pandemic. And we immediately saw a very dramatic slowing of travel. And we've estimated that statewide there was a VMT reduction in estimated travel of about 75%. And of course, at the same time, we were seeing reduction globally. And so this change, right, has captured an enormous amount of attention, not just in connection with the COVID emergency, but in connection with a whole set of broader consequences, including sharp drops in air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, which we're now seeing reports of rising with the reopenings of various sectors of the economy. And there's just some of the headlines you see there in terms of the changes in travel patterns and the implications for people's work locations. So at the last meeting on May 13th, the Commission discussed teleworking as a long-term strategy to improve the transportation network, and a number of commissioners expressed an interest in supporting private sector telework in particular, and requested that we organize discussion going forward. So I and other Caltrans staff have met with Commission staff, and following this presentation, I'm anticipating working further with Commission staff to convene some conversations. Next slide, please. So what are the opportunities that we're trying to seize at this moment? Well, the shelter-in-place requirements have demonstrated the potential for teleworking at scale in both the public and private sectors, though there are very important exceptions. And I'll just take a moment to connect some of those exceptions to comments that you've heard today, because a number of today's presenters have been talking about industry sectors that are not conducive to teleworking. So for Monterey Salinas Transit, we heard about a region that is very dependent on agricultural employment, tourism employment. We heard about drops in city revenue. We heard reference to restaurants, to warehousing and retail, right? So when Keith Dunn talked about the importance of expenditures in the construction industry. So it's important to keep in mind as we talk about teleworking that we do have an economy broadly with a very large share of jobs that are not conducive to teleworking. So it's just something to keep in mind. Nonetheless, there are very substantial potential benefits that we're interested in pursuing as opportunities. Reduce greenhouse gas and air pollution emissions, right, is tops on here, along with reducing demand on our roadway facilities, and then the personal benefits that accrue to people who find teleworking, benefit to their personal lives, household budgets, etc. So just want to flag that list of benefits as well as some of those exceptions that relate to the nature of the economy and the nature of employment, and also flag the fact that we're talking really about two different phases. We're talking about a recovery period during which we have perhaps a continuation of suppressed transit ridership that is related to telework in our most urbanized, highly urbanized areas. And then longer term, right after recovery, what kind of changes might we see? So the next slide drills a little deeper. If you could advance, thank you, Paul. Drills a little deeper into the question of people whose work is suitable for telework, and thinking about this from the perspective of race and ethnicity. So we've recognized that some of these conversations have an equity implication, because what we see here is that Black and African American people and people of Hispanic and Latino ethnicity are much less likely to be in jobs that are suitable for telework. So as we think about the advantages for some households of telework, we want to think about, who's gaining those advantages and how we might provide some equity in benefits to other households who are doing important work that is not suitable for telework. And I'll mention, since we're focusing today on private sector, and there's a fact sheet we prepared regarding Caltrans activities around telework, but just as an example, in terms of this split between jobs that are appropriate for telework and jobs that aren't, within the department, we have roughly 21,000 total employees. Between 7,500 and 8,000 of those are field employees, right? So who are in jobs not suitable for telework. The U.S. Bureau of Labor statistics in 2017, 2018, they asked workers, could you work at home? People might have interpreted that differently, but about a quarter of the total workforce said yes, they could work at home. That's probably something of a combination between people who thought their jobs could be performed at home and people who thought they would be allowed to work at home. So this slide again just points to some of the way that different groups in the population are more likely to align with different industries and be differently affected by efforts at telework. Next slide, please. So another area of interest to us is the overall level of commute travel. So when we're talking about telework, we're talking about people doing their jobs without a commute trip. So as we try to seek the benefits with respect to climate, congestion, air quality, it's important to keep in mind what's in this little table here, I think is probably the key takeaway. This is a projection for 2050 that was prepared by the department's team working on the California Transportation Plan update. However, it's roughly comparable to what we see now in current conditions, which is that work trips are about 20% of total trip making. So commute trips as a whole are about 20% of total trip making. Their average length is longer than other trips. So we see between a 20 and 25% share of vehicle miles traveled is attributable to work trips. And without any dramatic changes, it's anticipated that we'd be seeing this pattern in 2050. So I want to note that prior to the pandemic, we didn't have any experience that really demonstrated cross-economy telework, right? So we are in kind of uncharted waters. I recognize that. But still, I think it's important to see this basic breakdown and understand that when we're focused on commute travel, we're focused on 1/5 of total trip making. All right, next slide, please. So wanted to make the commissioners and others aware that many of our public agencies have been looking at telework as a solution and as one part of the solution for some time. And again, our California Transportation Plan team has been reviewing some of the telework proposals from the MPOs around the state. And here are some examples of what they're looking at. But the main point I wanted to make here was that this has been an ongoing subject of interest. And as we work forward on this topic, we're going to want to meet up with our partners. There was a specific question raised to me about the role of telework in the RTP SESs and whether the Air Resources Board accepts telework strategies as part of the sustainable community strategies that the regions are preparing. I did have a chance to speak with both CARB staff and SCAG and Sarah Jepson, the SCAG planning director, on this point. And I got a consistent answer, which is yes, Air Resources Board staff is open to seeing the inclusion of telework strategies as part of the sustainable community strategies, which are demonstrating how greenhouse gas emission reduction targets can be met, and that CARB staff in many cases has asked for justification and background on the assumptions about the level of telework that can be attained. Another issue I'm going to flag here, some of the agencies are focused on what we've come to call the digital divide, which is relates to the availability, particularly of high-speed internet, which is so essential not just for telework, but also for remote learning, telemedicine, and other critical services. And the department has a role in this as well through our broadband program. And that fact sheet, I believe, has some information on that, and we can follow up in a subsequent discussion if there's interest in discussing the department's progress in the broadband program. Next slide, please. So wanted to share some information about the administration's activities in terms of both state governments, telework policies, and the administration's work with private sector partners. So CalHR is addressing telework during recovery and beyond. Caltrans policies are kind of falling into line following the overall direction given by CalHR. So that's the source for the statewide policies that individual departments are then following. There are two activities that are specifically related to conditions during recovery and beyond. And CalSTA is participating directly in the Future Opportunities Task Force. CalSTA Deputy Secretary Lori Pepper, who focuses on innovative mobility, has been participating in the Future Opportunities Task Force. I think their work is actually closing out But this is one of the places where the opportunity to promote private sector telework has come up, and I've been interfacing with Deputy Secretary Pepper on that issue. The broader recovery task force was formed by the governor, and a team from Cal EPA is leading on the telework elements that are in discussion by the governor's recovery task force and one of its subgroups. And Cal EPA is conducting a survey of the private partners that are engaged in the task force. They're starting by asking about existing telework policies in a survey that I believe is now underway, and they anticipate following up to ask about forward-looking plans from their private sector members. So from conversations with Telstra and Cal EPA, I think that there's a positive channel for the commissioners and Caltrans to provide input to that wider effort through the recovery task force. And that's really going to be a very positive channel for ideas that come from the commissioners and others involved in that conversation. So my final slide, which is next, just highlight some considerations as we go forward to look forward to further conversation. So, first is to really take a serious look at the potential for telework to yield the benefits that we're looking for. So one consideration there is the commute as a share of total VMT. So we talked about that, the fact that commute is about a 20% share of total trip making. And then this second point I haven't mentioned yet, but it's very significant, which is if people are teleworking, what do we see as the overall travel changes for that household? So the pandemic situation has been unique because people have been, subject to stay-at-home orders while they've been teleworking. So we haven't seen other travel increase. But before the pandemic, the research experience showed that people tended, when they were working at home, particularly if, say, they were working at home for just 1 day a week, people would generally make an amount of travel equivalent to what their commute trip was. So I don't have to commute, I'm going to do other things in the car instead. So while we sometimes might imagine that we save all that VMT from a commute trip, that's not what's been documented in the research. And we are having some research synthesis prepared, so we'll be able to continue our discussion from a place of information. And then the third point, which I, in error, left off this slide, is the point about the overall sectoral organization of our economy and the percentage of jobs that simply are not conducive to telework. The second set of considerations we may want to dive into are the impacts on the people who are teleworking. So some of the issues there are the challenges associated with the absence of in-person interaction, the risk of social isolation, which we would want to find ways to address. And then the second, I think, is also very much an equity issue, and the fact that many of us are thinking about professional teleworkers who may have the space at home for home working, who may have unlimited broadband service and the equipment they need and the furnishings they need to work comfortably at home. But if telework becomes more expansive for a longer period of time, there may be challenges for many individuals in finding appropriate workspace. So that's something we'll want to be sensitive to as well. And then third would be a challenge for organizations integrating new employees into teams and organizations if they don't have the in-person interaction with colleagues. And of course, you on the commission are dealing with that with your new commission colleagues, so I'm sure you can appreciate the challenge. Another point we may want to touch on is the set of broader opportunities to switch travel habits and gain benefits. So rather than just thinking about the benefits of telework, we may want to think about other travel modes that people are getting additional exposure to during shelter in place, particularly, again, because of the suppressed transit ridership. And then the other is the possibility of a wider digital substitution effort that we're also getting exposed to during the pandemic, such as telemedicine. And the California Transportation Plan team has looked at this and identified the increased level of benefit to GHG reduction, air pollution reduction that would be connected to addressing a broader set of trips beyond just the commute trips. So that's another opportunity we may wish to consider in subsequent conversation. And then that last point there does address the issue of the digital divide, getting high quality broadband access to underserved, disadvantaged communities that include in many cases rural and remote communities. So we're looking forward to continuing the conversation. There's a lot here. It's a very rich area, and the director and I really appreciate the commission's interest. So with that, I'm happy to take any comments or look forward to following up with staff and scheduling a conversation.
Thank you so much. And Ellen, I just wanted to say you've been incredibly available to all of us as we've asked for briefings on some of these issues. And so I want to thank you and your staff for really trying to get at some of these issues while the things are moving in real time. And so I have a couple of questions, but I'm going to save my questions until after my colleagues have asked their questions. And so I want to start with Commissioner Liu, and then after Liu, it will be Eager and then Inman. So first, Commissioner Liu.
Thank you. Yeah, and Ellen, you alluded to this. If we look at the published studies, and I have to admit that after I asked staff for some citations, I went down that rabbit hole yesterday for quite some time. The benefits of telecommuting don't always appear to be as great as we might expect. And so I think that there may be circumstances in which we can help to maximize the benefits, the congestion relief, the climate and air quality benefits of telecommuting. And if the department and the staff haven't already done so, I think the recommendation from me would be to start working with our stakeholders to figure out what, if anything, we can do to maximize the benefits of teleworking and kind of buck the trend of a lot of the research showing that the benefits aren't all that great.
Right. Well, we are looking forward to conversation with the commissioners about the direction of that effort. I think you're correct that the complexities of human behavior combined with the complexities of the economy have made it difficult to gain the benefits we'd like to see.
Oh, thank you. And now if we could move to Commissioner Eager.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering, so your slide where you talked about the commute as a share of vehicle miles traveled, I was wondering if you all looked at the difference between urban and rural commuting. I certainly understand that that's an average, what you put up there, but for example, in Fresno County, we have 6,000 square miles and most of the jobs are in the city of Fresno. So people do travel a lot for work, not necessarily for play. So I'm wondering if that went into any of the research that you had done.
So yeah, that data comes from the modeling effort that the California Transportation Plan team has done, and they are able to disaggregate by region or by county, or I think they use kind of a super region. So we can provide that data in the follow-up. But yes, as the places where people have longer commute trips, they may indeed have shorter trips, or fewer non-commute trips. Although some of those rural locations also do require, high school students to make longer trips to school, longer trips to community college, and hospitals, medical facilities as well, because those destinations are also spaced further apart. But we can look into that and provide some greater detail that will be specific to the different parts of the state.
That'd be great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And now Commissioner Inman.
Yeah, just I have some questions, and I think for all of us, we have just experienced a mass experiment in terms of doing something that we never really imagined, which was all of us to shelter in place or stay at home and convert almost overnight to working remotely and working for a company that never ever considered it to, okay, we're ready to do it, and we did it. I'm thinking that where I hope we all land at the backside of this is some hybrid where we're not all isolated, because I don't think that's healthy. But, as Commissioner Dunn has brought up so many times, if we just, take public transportation one day a week, I mean, what could we do if we all end up in a hybrid situation? So perhaps, 3 days a week we work from home, or 2 days a week. And then I think we also need to look at the time when we have returned to work and we work on our various return to work plans. We're staggering schedules to keep people socially distanced. So there may be some other benefits we can get from some of these other tweaks to how we work, because we can reduce congestion by not having everybody start at exactly the same time. And then lastly, if we look at education, and we've all become keenly aware of how codependent we are, especially with our families that have children that are trying to learn online at the time the parents are trying to work online. And then higher ed in Los Angeles area, we can tell you our traffic gets measurably more congested once the college year starts. And so I think that there's so many facets to this. I would just encourage all of us to really put our heads together and really figure out how could we benefit from this mass experiment that we've all done. So thank you, Ellen.
Thank you. I think, you're pointing to some, important factors for us to consider. And I think the phrase mass experiment is very apt, and it will be helpful to use some of the data from before as well as the data from during to understand, if we have a hybrid, what is the hybrid model that might enable the capturing of the most benefit?
That's great. Thank you. And now, Commissioner Dunn.
Ellen, thank you so much for this, and thank you, Madam Chair, for calling on this one. I love this stuff, and I'm going to share with you, with my mask on, anywhere, anytime you need for a call on me to support your efforts as we pursue this. I couldn't agree more strongly with Commissioner Inman now, that we are in a real-time experiment right now. And if we're not asking our transportation research arms from UCI, UC Davis, to get us real-time data, not 2017 data, not 2013 data, but to take a look at this, I think we're losing a major opportunity. Now, I want to share with you, my personal philosophy, I am an all of the above girl. I think, as Fran said, I've been a big proponent of just one trip a week, trying to establish that in the city of Irvine and then in the SCAG region, to take transit and do something else besides just getting in the single family car. But right now, at the same time, we're seeing a real strong pushback on SB 743, planning to be implemented in July. And yet 80% of our VMT is work commute. So if we are really not jumping on this in a thoughtful way to figure out how to incentivize folks that can, and yes, there are jobs that can't, but incentivize those that can work commute, I just think we're losing an opportunity to impact significantly on climate change and greenhouse gas reductions, in addition to quality of life, which has been a really major factor. I'm also struggling, and I say this out loud because, again, remember, I'm an all of the above girl. I think there's an important role for transit, an important role for biking, an important role for even the vehicle that we've become so dependent on. But I wonder sometimes, and this is also needs to be, I think, explored, that there isn't a transit bias because our whole systems have been how to increase transit, how to increase ridership. Great. But here's something really different that could be threatening, perhaps, to transit funding if we don't think in a very proactive kind of new box, outside the box kind of thinking that allows us to have alternatives, particularly as this pandemic is going to be with us for some time, that we couldn't figure out how great our transit systems are and to keep them going, but also use this as well. So 80% of VMT is work commute. We've got to think of something better than this when we've got SB 743 about to hit and hit hard. So Ellen, anytime, any place, I will bring my mask. I will bring my hand sanitizer. I will come.
I appreciate that.
And work with you and talk the hard issues. I just would really like us to think about this as a great opportunity that I firmly believe when we break down silos and we can connect and connect dots over many different silos. And this seems to be one that helps even housing. This helps housing. So, because you can live anywhere, right? And you don't have to worry about living in an elevator building in downtown LA and fighting CEQA rules and regulations. Anyway, I did pontificate, but do you have any response to any of that? Any thoughts to share?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Dunn. Thanks for the comments. So we will be calling on you to be part of this conversation. And I know you put your hand up during the May meeting and asked the director, to provide a forum for discussion. So this was really meant to be laying a foundation for some conversation about actions. So I'm not familiar with the statistic that you're citing, so I'll be interested to follow up with you offline and maybe get some support from our District 12 colleagues as well on better understanding that. And I'll just follow up very briefly on the one point that really does relate to conversations recently about SB 743 that I think you and others will be interested in, which is there has been a very specific question raised about whether programs to support telework would be considered as VMT mitigation under the 743 program. And we have been having an active conversation about that with the Office of Planning and Research, and they've been very positive about that opportunity. So I think that is aligned with your philosophy. So just wanted to mention that, and I think we don't have time for further detail today,
Yes.
so I'll look forward to further convection.
I'm ready. Mask and sanitizer in hand, whatever you need.
Okay, that's wonderful. I'm so glad I had you all ask your questions first, because you hit a lot of the questions that I had. My last questions before we conclude this item is that I think we also need to realize that we exist right now in a time of 20% unemployment. And even pre-COVID, there were predictions that 25% of job classifications were potentially going to be going away in our new economy. And we need to not only think about telework and telelearning, but actually tele-upskilling and training. That people may not be going back to their old job because their old job may not exist, but new jobs will exist. And we need to make sure that there is Wi-Fi equity and telecommute equity to ensure that we can give people the opportunities to upskill and to find that new career in the new economy. And then the second is that I agree with Fran and Lucy that we may not be doing all or nothing in telecommuting, but that this is going to be an important tool in flattening the rush hour curve and making sure that we can use our transit seats and transportation space wisely, so that if people have the ability not to be in a vehicle at a certain time, they can telecommute, that we can start flattening that rush hour curve and ensuring that while we are still responding to COVID-19, that we can assure that we have public distancing while also building back transit ridership. Do you have any questions or any comments on that, Ellen? Because I know this is something we had also talked about as it related to 743 and getting back to mitigation measures and understanding how people use roads again.
Thank you, Commissioner Norton. I think I would just like to comment on the point about the overall economic impacts. At least in the short term, when we are going to be addressing the needs of many, many households, that are economically stressed, and just to be sensitive to the fact that we may really see a tension between the fact that we may be hopeful that more people will be working from home, but people's space at home may be under duress, right? So,
that's right.
We may see young adults moving back in with parents because they may not be able to afford their own places, or more multi-generational living. And so, we need to be just very cautious about assumptions about people's conditions at home, and really think about what the responsibility is of the individual versus the employer, in making sure that people have safe, adequate, and productive workplaces that don't create an economic burden, and that the public infrastructure, hopefully including, the fundamental infrastructure for broadband provision, that is in place, and that we do what our organizations can do to support that, so that there is, we're on a path to universal access.
Thank you. That's very wise. And we just wanted to ask if we can make sure that we get your presentation that we could distribute to all of the commissioners.
Yes, commission staff has the presentation and the Caltrans fact sheet that provides some additional information on what the department has been doing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And
it's a pleasure.
Thank you. And I'm going to conclude this item. And commissioners, we have item 22 and beyond, and those are all shop items that we can take together. I need to ask the commission's indulgence and just break for a small bio break. Let's come back at 3:30. So we've all been sitting here for a little bit. It's after lunch. We'll come back at 3:30 and we'll do the speed round for the rest of the items. Okay, thank you very much.